Okay, welcome back. And as promised, tonight we will talk about the War of 1812. See, that's what happened. I said last week I'm going to talk about the War of 1812, and 90% of the class stayed home. But now I know who are the serious students. So now this is something of an anomalous war, although a very important one. I mentioned actually a couple of things I should mention first leading up to the war. Last time we talked about the embargo of 1808, which was President Jefferson's attempt to teach the world a lesson, and it failed. It didn't work, and even I have to admit that. Then the United States does try to maintain its neutrality, as both England and France have other problems than worrying about what the Americans are doing. Now, one thing that happens in the interim, in 1811, as you'll probably remember, in 1791, Congress had chartered the first Bank of the United States, or the Bank of the United States. No one knew there was ever going to be another one. And as you may recall, there was a big discussion about whether Congress had the power to charter a bank. And what did we decide back in 1791? Yeah, they did. Okay. Now, in 1811, the charter comes up, and the party in power are the folks who had said 20 years earlier, this is unconstitutional. And Congress actually was more doctrinaire on this than the president was. Madison believed in the separation of powers, and so the doctrinaire Republicans in Congress said, we're not going to recharter the bank because we thought it was unconstitutional 20 years ago. We haven't changed our mind, and the bank dies. They don't recharter it. The Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, thinks this is a mistake, not rechartering the bank, but Congress is the one that makes the decision, and the bank goes. So, that's going to come back to us later on. Madison still has constitutional scruples about whether the bank is constitutional or not, and we'll also come back to that particular issue soon enough. Okay, so then what happens? 1812, the issues of the war are this. The British are, they're maintaining a blockade of Europe. You cannot trade with continental Europe and also trade with us. The French are trying to maintain a blockade of England. You can't trade with England and also trade with us. Each side, still the same thing they were doing back in 1807. Okay? Also, the British continue to claim the right to seize American sailors, or sailors they claim to be British deserters, off of American ships. And you see all kinds of wild numbers. The British claim that half or a third of the sailors on American merchant ships actually are deserters from the British fleet, and nobody carries a passport in those days. There's no way of identifying who you are, and the British will simply, stop a ship and look and say, it turns out that a lot of the really able-bodied seamen, the strong husky guys, it turns out are the ones they say are British deserters. So very interesting stories about these individuals we don't need to get into. Anyway, thing to remember, spring of 1812, the British government decides we're not going to do this anymore. They're not going to stop American ships. Okay? News of this does not reach the United States until after the Congress has declared war. Congress doesn't know the British government has decided this. Meanwhile, there is a British ship off of New York waiting to stop any American ships sailing out of New York. That's what Congress knows. Congress declares war on England, and the war is, the war does not go well for the United States. There was great optimism when Congress declared war. Some of the more belligerent members of Congress were sure that within 6 weeks the United States would have taken Canada. Henry Clay, congressman from Kentucky, said the Kentucky militia alone can take Canada in a week. It's kind of a grand statement. There were young guys in Congress who were really eager for a war for a variety of reasons, to teach the British a lesson and so on, not looking at the woeful unpreparedness of the United States. And at the same time, there's this war with England in the offing. There's a major war going on within the United States against the Creek Indians and an alliance of native people led by the Shawnee. Long story. There's a Shawnee prophet, Tenskwatawa. The name actually means loudmouth, and he's kind of an interesting story. He's one of the religious prophets who emerge among the native people, saying to renounce the ways of white people and get back to the purity of our own ways, and so on. And then his brother is Tecumseh, who is a warrior, and they put together an alliance of the native people from the lower Mississippi River Valley, the Chickasaws, the Creeks, up to Canada, an alliance against the whites. There's a story about Tecumseh going to talk to the native people up in the Detroit area and saying he is going to go back down to the area where the Chickasaw live, and when he meets with them, he will stomp his foot on the ground when they agree to war. And it turns out a few weeks later there's an earthquake in Detroit, which of course they take to be the sign that he has stomped his foot. So this war on the frontier between these folks, and of course Henry Clay and the others believe, quite rightly, the British are arming the enemies, these Indians, on the frontier. So that's another reason for going to war, so they'll stop arming the Indians. Now, these all might be, just causes for war, but the war is very unpopular in New England. In fact, I don't believe you can find a less popular war in the whole history of the country in New England than this one. The Massachusetts legislature voted not to allow the militia from Massachusetts to be sent out of the state. And, we're all familiar. In fact, Boston is home to the last remaining warship of this conflict, and we're all quite fond of the ship, as we should be, the USS Constitution. The Boston merchants suggested to the captain of the Constitution that he actually move the ship further down the harbor, because if the British invaded, they would probably want to take the ship, and if they try to do that inside the harbor, it might cause damage to their ships as well as to the town. So they suggest to the captain of the Constitution moving the ship out. And there is a real prospect of a British invasion. In fact, the British blockade New England for most of the war. The governor is really reluctant to do anything to create defenses because he thinks the war is a big mistake. Now imagine that. The British have warships off the coast. In fact, one of the great naval battles of the war takes place just off Boston Light. This is in 1813. You probably know this. James Lawrence and the ill-fated Chesapeake, same ship that the British took back in 1807. James Lawrence brings his crew out of Boston Harbor on the Chesapeake, and they encounter the British frigate Shannon. I mean, they've gone looking for the Shannon because they know it's right off the coast, and Lawrence and his sailors fight the British sailors on the Shannon, and it's a rout. Lawrence's words, as he's carried below, he's mortally wounded, and as he's carried off the main deck, does anyone know what he says? His last command, don't give up the ship. And what do you suppose happens as soon as he's down below? They give up the ship. They surrender. Okay? And then the ship is towed up to Halifax, where actually the British give Lawrence a hero's funeral. And then we negotiate. The British allow us to bring Lawrence's body, as well as that of his lieutenant, back to Salem, given a hero's funeral there, a hero's funeral in New York. He's buried in Trinity Churchyard. By the way, I know we're supposed to talk about the Constitution, and here I am talking about James Lawrence and don't give up the ship. Oliver Hazard Perry has that sewn onto a flag, which he uses at the Battle of Lake Erie. That's another story which regrettably, because Ignacio wants to hear about how the Constitution relates to this, I won't be able to tell you. Anyway, it's kind of a mixed bag as far as the war goes. Okay, they have the Indian War on the frontier, which doesn't go entirely well, but in Canada, the American Army, which does not take Canada, does manage to kill Tecumseh, and that weakens the Indian alliance. Okay, but the Creeks are at war with the United States. An army goes south to put down the Creeks and does other things, which we'll talk about in a bit. Number of things happen. Okay, another thing, September 1814, August 1814, huge British fleet enters the Chesapeake Bay and burns Washington. This is actually, I believe it may be the only time in our history that the president tries to rally troops, militia forces at Bladensburg, Maryland, and doesn't really work. Washington is burned. Madison finds the rest of his cabinet in Virginia. You probably know the story about Dolly Madison cutting the portrait of Washington out of its frame and saving it from the White House as the British come and they burn the executive mansion. The reason it's called the White House is because after the war, the charred sandstone walls that were all that was left were painted white. Okay. Previously, it had been called the executive mansion. Burn the Capitol, burn the Treasury. Our side actually burns the Navy Yard to keep it from falling into British hands. Now, it's a disastrous thing when your capital is burned. The British, though, they're not. Washington isn't their objective. Their real objective, of course, is, Philadelphia. And they move on to Baltimore and don't manage to take Baltimore. There are a couple of other things happening at this point. September 1814. The British have their fleet in the Chesapeake and have burned Washington. They're on their way to Baltimore. They also have an army of about 10,000 men making its way down Lake Champlain. And they're on their way to New York. There's been this kind of stalemate on Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and the Perry and his forces have kept the British from moving further from Lake Ontario into the interior. Perry, under that flag, "Don't give up the ship," defeats the British at the Battle of Lake Erie. Right, it's a great message he writes to the Secretary of the Navy. If you didn't know "Don't give up the ship," I'm sure you don't know this one. "We have met the enemy, and he is ours." Isn't that great? Doesn't that make a chill go down your spine when you hear that? We've met the enemy, and he is ours. Then lists the ships that he captured on the Battle of Lake Erie. Battle of Lake Ontario, the Americans prevent the British from moving further. But that's not the big news. The big news is this. There's been this war going on in Europe, okay? Napoleon has his forces in Russia in 1812. You probably know that. That's the moment the United States declares war on England, when England is fighting off Napoleon along with, really no one else other than the Russians, who have Napoleon at the gates of Moscow. And, okay, so, just to back up a bit, I'm sorry, I'm botching this whole story of the War of 1812 and not making you see the excitement of it. What do you think? Madison, I think, realizes this was a mistake pretty early because, England is kind of preoccupied fighting Napoleon, but what do we have to gain out of this? Initially, the United States does do some impressive things. Well, initially, one of the first things that happens in the war, and I'm sorry for backing up, is General William Hull, who is the American commander at Detroit, is surrounded by a force of British and Indians, and he surrenders Detroit. Okay, so, you've declared war in June of 1812, and you think you're going to take Canada in 6 weeks, and by mid-August, you've lost Detroit. That's not a good sign. Happily for us, and for General Hull's family honor, his cousin Isaac Hull, takes the Constitution out and defeats the British warship Guerriere in August of 1812 off the coast of Nova Scotia, defeats the Guerriere, and, there are several instances in 1812 when an American frigate encounters a British frigate at sea. They engage in single ship combat, and the American wins. So the Constitution defeated the Guerriere. And then the Constitution went out almost immediately again, and off the coast of Brazil fought the Java. If you ever go aboard the Constitution, you'll notice the helm, it's 2 wheels. It actually was taken from the Java because during the battle the Constitution's wheel had been blown away. And so Captain Bainbridge, after the battle, has the Java's wheel taken off. During the battle, his ship was disabled. He had a dozen Marines on each side of the line that controls the rudder below, and he would shout the order down which way they should pull the line to turn the rudder. He didn't want the Java to know his ship couldn't steer. The sailors aboard the Constitution like to say it took 24 Marines to do what one sailor could do. I don't know if any of you were Marines. I didn't say this. I'm just repeating what was told to me. So you have that, and then, of course, in December of 1812, the USS United States encounters the Macedonian off the coast, off the Cape Verde, and defeats it. And when Bainbridge fought the Java was disabled, he got all the survivors off, and then sunk the Java, let the Java sink. The Guerriere, also disabled, get the survivors off, let it sink. Decatur has the Macedonian fitted out to sail home and brings it into New York on New Year's Day of 1813, bringing home a British frigate as a prize. This is one of these great events that should stir our national pride. Does it stir your national pride, Ignacio? Yeah, it would have. There's this great moment in Washington, actually. There have been a number of these encounters between individual American ships and British ships, and in every instance, the United States wins. Now, think about it. For the previous 20 years, these British sailors have been almost continuously at war, and I think I keep seeing different numbers about how many single ship engagements the British had fought in the previous 20 years. It's in the hundreds, and they hadn't lost any. And now they fight 5 single ship combats with Americans, and they lose every one. This is one of those tremendous feats. And excuse me?
Why doesn't that happen?
Well, the British claimed that these American frigates actually weren't frigates. They had more armament than frigates usually had, and that's why, we thought it was a frigate. It turns out to be a line of battleship. Had we known they had so many guns, we wouldn't have engaged them. Okay, that's the official line of the British. Also, they'll say, well, of course, all of the sailors aboard these American ships are British sailors. So they're really good. And so, anyway, with the Macedonian, Decatur sends one of his lieutenants. He brings his United States into New London, Connecticut, with the flag of the Macedonian. And he has one of his lieutenants, whose father happens to be Secretary of the Navy, take it down to Washington. And he happens to arrive one day when they're having a big party in Washington because the other victorious captains, Hull, Bainbridge, Porter, are all in town. So they're having this party for them. And a rumor spreads through Washington that afternoon that the United States has taken the Macedonian. The Macedonian was a brand new ship. The British could also say, yeah, Guerriere, Java, they were old ships. Captains weren't that good. Macedonian is a new ship, has a pretty good captain, okay? And people in Washington hear, hey, we've taken the Macedonian. So people illuminate their windows as a form of celebration, but then there's no confirmation of this rumor. People feel a little foolish, go to this party anyway. There's music, dancing, naval heroes, and then at 9:30 the door opens, the music stops, and there stands Lieutenant Hamilton with the flag of the Macedonian. The place erupts. The other naval captains and the Secretary of the Navy take the flag and parade around the room with it over their heads, and then they bring it to the side of the room where Dolly Madison is standing, and they lay it at her feet. Someone thinks that's a little over the top. This is one of those great moments, okay? A great moment for us. Now, one thing we all should remember, the British weren't stupid. They say, okay, we've had 5 of these single ship encounters with American vessels. If you see an American vessel, don't fight it. They stopped this. And they said, okay, what we'll do is blockade the American coast. which they do very effectively. Now all these American frigates are stuck in port. We'll see how much they can do when they're stuck in New London or in Savannah or some other place. A pretty effective thing to do. So the New England coast now is blockaded by the British. The United States has not taken Canada, and things are kind of a stalemate. Now, Madison realized that this wasn't going to go as easily as Henry Clay had thought it would. So almost immediately on the declaration of war, Madison sends negotiators off to Europe to negotiate with the English. And he sends a pretty good diplomatic team. Albert Gallatin, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and James Bayard, a senator from Delaware, who go off to negotiate with the British in Belgium. The British see this war as a distraction, but they also see they can win it. The negotiations are kind of going on this track while this war is going on here, fighting in Canada, fighting in Alabama, and then this naval blockade. The real naval fighting after 1813 is on the Great Lakes, where Perry and other captains build fleets to fight the British as they're both contesting for control of the Great Lakes, and the United States actually wins on Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. But then you have this British invasion of the Chesapeake in 1814, and also this British invasion down Lake Champlain. Also, 1814, the British have fought Napoleon's armies in Spain and beaten them. And that army, the army that beat Napoleon, is now on its way to the Mississippi River Valley, where it is going to come, take New Orleans, join up with these native people, the Chickasaws, the Creeks in the southeast, and take the Mississippi River Valley away from the United States. So the end of 1814, this is the way things look for us. Okay, yeah, we've gotten control of the Great Lakes, and that's a good thing, I suppose. But we have this British force coming down Lake Champlain to take New York. Okay, we have another British force that's come up the Chesapeake, burned Washington, is on its way to Baltimore, and once it gets done with Baltimore, it'll be on to Philadelphia. Then we have a third force that's coming up the Mississippi River to join up with the native people there. Okay, so if we're looking at a map, also we have New England is blockaded. The British are holding Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, as well as the coast of Maine. So this doesn't really look good. And it's at this moment, in the fall of 1814, that the Massachusetts legislature, which was against the war to begin with, no, our troops aren't going to fight in this. It tells the Constitution, don't have any naval battles around here. It might, break the windows and so on. A bunch of Harvard students and others actually get together to put fortifications on Noddle's Island, what is today East Boston, and they call it Fort Strong, naming it for the governor. It's kind of an ironic twist. The New Englanders, the Massachusetts, Connecticut legislatures, call for a convention of the New England states to get together to see if there is some way of stopping this madness, this disastrous war, which has been brought upon by the stupidity of these Republicans, the same people who brought us the embargo. When Massachusetts says it's not going to send any troops, James Monroe, the Secretary of War, says he will send troops to subdue Massachusetts. Well, that's a big joke. They didn't have troops that could subdue the British. And someone says, Madison will need a faster horse if he wants to come here and subdue us. Madison's been wandering around Virginia looking for the rest of his cabinet. So the only recourse for the New Englanders is to have a convention of their states which will, if necessary, create their own union, make peace with England, and have a confederation of the New England states. Okay? Because right now it doesn't look like there's going to be much left of the rest of the country. This army is going to take the Mississippi River Valley. This army is probably going to take Philadelphia, and if we know what's good for us, we'll get out of this. This one's going to take New York. Yeah. Someone said that this was actually the most popular movement in New England since 1775, this movement for New England secession from the rest of the Union. A Union that has been corrupted by these crazy Virginians with their Republican ideas. A number of the folks you may remember, like Timothy Pickering, who had been Washington's Secretary of State, or I'm sorry, Adams' Secretary of State, Gouverneur Morris, Harrison Gray Otis, a congressman, senator from Massachusetts, are pushing this convention to get out of the Union, form their own republic, which won't have this baggage with them. Gouverneur Morris wrote that one day people who now are considered traitors and madmen will be regarded as patriots and sages. In the spring, in December of 1814, delegates from the New England states meet at Hartford to consider seceding from the Union. 26 delegates, and they decide, more moderate people say, well, we could secede immediately, considering how badly these folks have botched it. And look, we've had Jefferson, who was from Virginia, and now we have Madison, who is from Virginia. So it's now been 14 years we've been having these people in charge. Look at the disaster they have brought on. As if the embargo wasn't bad enough, now they've led us into war with the greatest naval power in the world, and we're the ones who are suffering. We've been blockaded now for 3 years. Yeah, they burned Washington, but good enough. Who would want to build a capital city in a swamp anyway? We could secede immediately, but instead, why don't we present demands to Madison, which he then will have an option of either taking or rejecting. If he rejects them, we'll have good reason to get out. Incidentally, while this is happening, Washington's been burned. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, actually thinks the best thing Madison could do is resign and then have Congress make Rufus King president. King has been ambassador to England, and King, a good New England Federalist, may be able to patch things up with England, but it does seem like the end is near. Even Jefferson, writing to Madison, thinks, once this army gets to New Orleans, it's it for that part of the country, so we have to hold on here. This would be a gloomy time for us, unless you're a New Englander and thinks, boy, this is our time to get away from those Virginians. Good enough. Make peace with England, and that will be the end of this experiment with this particular government. Okay, so the Hartford Convention comes up with its demands. And they say, okay, we'll meet again in June. Someone will go to Washington, and if they can find Madison in the charred ruins of the Capitol, they will present him with our demands, and we'll give him until June. In June, we will reconvene, and then we'll be able to talk about seceding. And the demands are as follows. They're going to drop the 3/5 clause from the Constitution. Not because of any great qualms about the enslaved people, but because this gives the southern states more representatives in Congress for people who don't vote. It also gives them more presidential electors. So drop the 3/5 clause. We will no longer count slaves toward representation in Congress. Okay? We will also require a 2/3 vote of Congress to admit new states or to block foreign trade. Not having a simple majority, letting Louisiana into the Union, and then all the other states they're going to make out of this territory, which is going to drain the power of New England. You'll need a 2/3 vote to do something like that. Stopping foreign trade is one thing, a 2/3 vote for that, but absolutely no embargo. That will be unconstitutional for Congress to impose an embargo. Also, we will prohibit naturalized citizens from holding office. Only citizens born here can hold office. Albert Gallatin has been Secretary of the Treasury now for 14 years, and the New Englanders would say he's French. No more of that. Okay? Also, presidents cannot be reelected, and successive presidents can't be from the same state. You're not going to have one Virginian following another Virginian. The Connecticut and Massachusetts legislatures both endorse these proposals quite enthusiastically, and they send their emissary off to Washington to present these demands to President Madison. And I don't see what choice he'll have. He has to agree to these things, or the New England states will leave the Union, and that's going to leave him with a pretty small country to be president of. When they started in 1812, they thought, yeah, we're going to take Canada. We're stretching out to the Rocky Mountains. And now, what a disaster. See, Ignacio, we were thrilled with pride at the victories of the Constitution in the United States. And now, 1814, 1815, things look really grim. This is usually the moment when I shut off the lights and the delegates from New England arrived in Washington on the same day two other pieces of news reached Washington. And one was that around Christmas of 1814, the American negotiators and the British negotiators had worked out a peace treaty. And under the terms of the peace treaty, both sides simply would go back to the way things were before the war. Neither side would keep any of the territory it had taken from the other. So the British would not hold on to Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, the coast of Maine. The Americans wouldn't hold any of the pieces of the Great Lakes they had, and so that's pretty good. Also, we're not going to demand reparations from either side. We're just going to stop fighting, pretend the war never happened, and just go on as things were before. Now, if you think about it, you've had this army making its way down Lake Champlain, this army here, and now the British say, well, no more of that. Actually, I should tell you that the American Navy turns back the British at Lake Champlain in September of 1814. Another story, regrettably, we can't talk about tonight. Okay, so that's a good thing. Okay, and the preparations for defending New York turned out not to be necessary because the British are defeated up in Plattsburgh. But then the other piece of news that reached Washington that same day was that this huge British force sent to the Mississippi River had been virtually annihilated by an American force made up of the Kentucky and Tennessee militias, the Army of the South commanded by Andrew Jackson, river pirates, Creoles, Choctaws. They had fought this British army, the army that beat Napoleon at the just outside New Orleans on January 7th, and annihilated them. It's one of the great victories in the history of warfare, the Battle of New Orleans, in which these American militia forces, along with these others, defeat the most powerful army ever sent to North America. That piece of news arrives in Washington the same day. So you have a peace treaty by which we don't lose anything. It's a draw. But then the biggest battle of the war that happened about 2 weeks after the peace treaty had been worked out is a one-sided victory for us. So these poor guys from New England who had come down to present their demands to President Madison discover that now Madison is a hero for having won the war. He had overseen this great victory, this shrewd negotiated settlement, because he sent over the best negotiators he had, and quite frankly, the British did not send the best negotiators they had, and this victory in New Orleans. So, I don't know, these poor guys from New England, Madison didn't have to listen to their demands. They do look like a bunch of fools now, if not traitors. The Blue Light Federalists, that name is picked up, the Federalists, according to the story I've heard in Connecticut, the American fleet that was blockaded in New London periodically would try to get out into Long Island Sound, and someone in New London would flash a blue light from the shore to signal the British fleet that they're on their way out. So if you're a Federalist now, it's really bad news because you're a traitor. You were signaling the enemy during the war. Even though you thought, we've lost the war was wrong, it was brought on by the stupidity of these folks in power, you were in cahoots with them. So, the folks from New England go back to New England and they are kind of dispirited, don't see a reason for continuing with this idea of seceding from the Union, because now the Union's not falling apart, the Union is together, and what do you know, Madison won the war after all. You know, Madison periodically is held up to, well, the rap used to be he wasn't a very good president. I think actually he was. And one thing to remember here is he manages to win this war without expanding the size of the federal government, which might have been a mistake. And anyway, later on we'll tell you what a great guy Madison was. Okay, any questions on this? Should we sing the great song that comes out of the war? As Francis Scott Key was watching the British bombarding Fort McHenry. Well, and later on they say the British are stopped at Baltimore. Okay, another thing I should have mentioned. Some other day we'll have a whole War of 1812 day. The War of 1812's bicentennial is coming up, I understand. So stay tuned for events and other things. Very unpopular war in New England. Just remember that. You know, New England doesn't really like the war and thinks it was a big mistake. The Massachusetts legislature keeps carping about the war. In fact, in 1816, one of the heroes of the war gives a toast in Petersburg, Virginia. Now, this was a tradition of giving toast. I don't think people do this anymore. You know, if you've ever been to a wedding, you've heard someone give a toast that usually is kind of long, inappropriate, tedious. And a toast in the traditional sense would be you would raise your glass and then you would say, like, the person you're toasting, okay? So just two words, and then shortly the reason why you're toasting them. And the real purpose is for everybody to join in giving this toast and then drink, and then someone else will give a toast and you'll drink some more. But it's usually you'll see these toasts then printed in newspapers. List of toasts, and you would toast, if it's a patriotic event, you would toast the president, the vice president, you know, various other folks. You can actually see a breakdown in the 1790s with the Federalists always toasting Washington, and the Republicans often toasting the president, or, you know, but then other different groups of folks. The Republicans toast the Declaration of Independence and our French brethren, much more so than they will toast, say, Secretary Hamilton or our friends in England. You'll see really interesting political breakdowns. But this toast in Petersburg, Virginia, in February of 1816 by Commodore Decatur is one that lives on in American history. Our country, in her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but always successful, right or wrong. And people take that as a slam against the Massachusetts legislature, which apparently had wanted the country to be unsuccessful. Now, it lives on in kind of an abbreviated form. Almost immediately, the newspapers pick it up as our country, and then the last three words, right or wrong. And it's had a long life. Many things with the War of 1812 have had a long life. And perhaps the most surprising of all, if you look at the way things were in September of 1814, is the country itself. So, having said all of this, we should move on to what happens after the war, and a number of really important things. One, in 1815, President Madison tells Congress, you know, for 20 years, we had a bank. And I didn't think a bank was constitutional. But Congress passed it, and for 20 years the American people accepted that this is something that Congress can do. So the American people apparently know more about the Constitution than I do. And if it's their wish to have a bank, and we've seen during the war how difficult it was to borrow money when we didn't have a bank, then maybe we should reestablish one. So Congress does. They pass a new bill chartering a Bank of the United States. They send it to Madison, and much to their surprise, he vetoes it because he thinks there are some features of this bill which are unconstitutional. So Congress then recharters the bank, draws up another bill removing those objections Madison had, and he signs it. Back in 1791, he said this was unconstitutional. He had led the fight against the bank's constitutionality, but now he bows to the superior wisdom of the American people. Congress creates a second Bank of the United States, given another 20-year charter. Okay? Then, in his annual message, Madison calls for internal improvements. Seeing during the course of the war how difficult it was to move stuff around, and particularly thinking of the difficulty of moving goods from one place to another, he proposes building roads, canals, and a national university. He also says, I don't think that the Constitution gives Congress the power to build roads, canals, or a national university, but we should look into amending the Constitution to do this. So he calls for internal improvements as a way of creating or binding the sections of the country together. And the secretary, actually former Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, who now is a member of Congress from South Carolina, draws up a bill for internal improvements, building roads and canals, doing the kind of infrastructure improvements, or I should say infrastructure creation, that now seems absolutely essential to hold the Union together. And on his last day in office, March 4th, 1817, Madison receives this bill from Congress to do what he had proposed in his annual message back at the end of 1816, and he vetoes it because the Constitution does not give Congress the power to do these things. And he says you cannot interpret the general welfare clause, the necessary and proper clause broadly. The burden should be on the states. Now he says, I am not unaware of the great importance of roads and canals and the improved navigation of watercourses, and that a power in the national legislature to provide for them might be exercised with signal advantage to the general prosperity. But seeing that such a power is not expressly given by the Constitution, and believing it cannot be deduced from any part of it without an inadmissible latitude of construction and a reliance on insufficient precedents, believing also that the permanent success of the Constitution depends on a definite partition of powers between the general and the state governments, and that no adequate landmarks would be left by the constructive extension of the powers of Congress, as proposed in this bill, I have no option but to withhold my signature from it, and to cherishing the hope that its beneficial objects may be attained by a resort for the necessary powers to the same wisdom and virtue in the nation which established the Constitution in its actual form, and providently marked out in the instrument itself a safe and practicable mode of improving it as experience might suggest. Okay. So Congress does not have this power. It would be dangerous for Congress simply to assert that it does have this power, but instead resort to the same wisdom and virtue in the nation, that is, in you folks, which created the Constitution, to give Congress the power if they think it should have it. But meanwhile, Congress can't simply take this power. You know, the Constitution itself says how it can be amended. So this is really Madison's farewell message here. He recognizes that the world is changing. Perhaps Congress should be able to do more things, but we also have to hold on to the values which created this instrument, a government of limited powers. So you can see that Madison is partly federal, partly national as he leaves office in 1817. 16 years after he had arrived in the capital on horseback, he leaves the capital, which is now being rebuilt, on a steamboat. That is, he knew the world was changing. He also knew that the Constitution itself marked out the limits of governmental power, and the government could only change by attuning itself to the wisdom and virtue in the nation. At this point, why don't we take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what else happens after Madison.